much time. So my name is Sawyer Ponsbeck. I'm an extension educator down in Oneida County. So Malad, Idaho is where I'm located at, predominantly focusing on cattle nutrition, beef management, and so that's kind of the focuses that I have. And today, I'm going to talk a little bit about some daily behavior and performance on some cows that we saw on a targeted grazing project that we did in Malad in fall of 2021 and fall of 2022. And these names up here, as you can see, and for those online, of course, if you have any questions, type them into the chat or feel free to raise your hand during this presentation. But we had a pretty good team put together on this project. Dr. Jim Sprinkle, beef extension specialist for the University of Idaho, was kind of lead on this project and did a great job putting this project together. Cole Kempton and Dan Maritson. Dan's actually in the back. Dan was our graduate student on the project and helped with data collection and some of the forage aspects on that project. Justin Hatch and myself, extension educators, and then a few other people, April Hewlett, Robert Mickelson, Hans Bastian, Jared Simpson was a cattle owner, provided these the cattle on this project, and of course, Jamie Brennan. So, cheatgrass, we've talked a lot about cheatgrass and annual grasses today and some of the problems that we have seen that they can cause within the Intermountain West and the United States in general, of course. And some of this is come to who's to blame and who's listening to the Art of Range podcast. Who's listening to this? It's a really good podcast, coming out with some pretty good episodes. And this one, they were talking with Barry Perryman about some of the applied research and cheatgrass, and I just wanted to play a portion of that really quick, talking a little bit about this that leads into why we do some targeted grazing.
You know, when our grazing systems, when the sort of our traditional grazing systems that we use throughout the Intermountain West were developed, they were developed at a time prior to, you know, invasive annuals becoming a significant portion of the landscape. Deferred rotation, of course, A.W. Sampson back, 1912, and then rest rotation later on with Gus Orme and his group in the 1950s, and so we imposed those, and it worked great for those systems, those perennial systems that didn't have any invasive annuals in them. They worked fantastic. The research showed it. And when they were implemented, it showed it that it was good for the perennial grasses. But now, over the intervening time, we began to overlay invasive annuals into the system. And when these grazing systems were developed, nobody checked to see what kind of an effect it would have on the invasive annuals that were growing alongside the perennials. We just continued to, implement what we've been implementing for grazing systems for the last several decades, and we just never thought to, I guess no one ever thought to ask the question, well, what could this be part of the problem that's shifting the dominance away from perennial grasses and towards the annual grasses? What's going on here? So we kind of, that's what happened. And then what we found out through research, and some of the basic research actually occurred in the 1970s, and then back to this, grass of the roof idea, it all pointed toward litter, ground litter. And the more ground litter, turns out the more standing dead litter you leave on the ground in the fall when cheatgrass begins to germinate, after the traditional grazing season, the more cheatgrass you're going to have over time. It's a pretty simple concept, and of course you refer to the Latin name of cheatgrass basically being the grass of the roof. Linnaeus named it, in Europe, and its preferred habitat at the time was growing on old thatched roofs and in piles of thatch when they would pull them off the roofs to replace them. So it all just sort of added up, and then of course the basic research in the 70s showed that litter, cheatgrass, and Medusa head as well need a litter accumulation to really do well. They just don't do well on bare soils or soils with low litter accumulations.
Okay, so pretty interesting clip there, a little bit on the history of that, but a lot of this, we see cheatgrass now in the systems that we have, and as we can see, I mean, it kind of was brought on by things we were told to do. The systems that worked really good for perennial systems, nobody ever really checked what is the annual grass is going to do in all this. Well, it's brought on a lot of extra pressure, and those annuals have come on, and that's really where we've kind of gained some of these problems that we now are working to deal with. This is a picture when we talk about cheatgrass and fire probability, which a lot of that has been spoken about today. I won't go too in depth with that, but we look at the Great Basin rangeland fire probability, and you look between Boise and Twin Falls area, and we have a high percentage of fire probability. And the reason, because of, well, with that fire probability, we'll get into some of those reasons. The higher the fire probability, of course, the more acres are traditionally burned. And this is a chart of different years and the acres that were burned in correlation with that probability. And here, that red dot on the line is our 2024 fire year. Quite a few acres burned, but we had a very high fire probability, just due to low moisture and the high litter content. But here in 2021, we had a pretty decent fire probability, but not necessarily a lot of acres burned. Anybody want to venture a guess as to why?
We had no dry lightning.
We had no dry lightning that year. Well, I'm not sure about that. Can anybody say COVID? When everybody was told to stay home, don't go anywhere, we didn't really have a lot of people recreating on some of these rangelands as much, causing fires and things like that. So I mean, that's maybe one venture to guess why 2021 had a lot lower acres burned that year. But a lot of this fire probability, when we're talking about targeted or fire probability and grazing, it goes into low resilience because we have a lot of annual grass. The annual grasses in between Twin Falls and Boise are very, very predominant. Now, the Western Governors Association is, governors have gotten together and identified areas that we are working to defend so that we don't accumulate a lot of these annual grasses, and kind of hope to prevent this problem from expanding into all parts of the state like we have here in this Western Idaho region. And the research that we did was done over in Malad, of course, and which is near that targeted area. And targeted grazing has been a thing for a while now, and with dormant season grazing, being able to remove that litter that we heard about in that little clip, to reduce the litter amount, and that will therefore kind of eliminate that area that cheatgrass thrives on. And so we were interested in looking at some of the behavior of these cattle during a dormant season grazing. This is this site you can see right near Malad City, Spring Hills allotment, about a 2,400 acre grazing allotment that was right here just east of Malad. Really pretty area. And we had this was some data, of course, that Dan collected as part of his project, but predominantly shrubs in this area, forbs about 17%. But 24% of that was annual grasses. We're beginning to see, or have seen for a while, that annual grasses are there. They are not the overall predominant herbaceous material yet, And we're trying to keep it that way. We're trying to get that percentage down through targeted grazing. As I said, in 2021 and 2022, we did this, and the funding was provided by the U.S. Forest Service and the Caribou-Targhee National Forest. We're super grateful for their support in this project. Well, the research objectives for this study and the behavioral study was to determine cow performance on targeted grazing, really to see how are they performing in these off grazing months traditionally. Also determining grazing locations. Where are these animals grazing? And then what kind of activity and how often are they walking, grazing, resting? All of these different parameters that we looked at. And we saw that there was a pretty big effect of course, precipitation and temperature, and weather on the behavior that affected the behavior of these cattle. 2021, we saw quite a bit of above average rainfall in the beginning of October. This study every year started on October 25th. We grazed for 27 days, beginning October 25th, both years. But in 2021, you see we had some pretty good green up, really good on the hillsides. In 21, this is a picture of my colleague Justin Hatch trailing cows up to that allotment from the site where we collared the cows and weighed them. We had a lot drier conditions, much more average precipitation that year. This is a picture of the collars that we actually used for the study. And as you can see that we did have an accelerometer in these as well as a GPS module. And so the GPS, of course, it helped us to determine where those cows are. Where are these cows grazing within that over 2,000 acre grazing allotment? And then we have an accelerometer. Can anybody tell me what the accelerometer does? Measures acceleration. Okay, measures movement. If you have a smartphone and you hold it up and you're watching a video on it, you turn it sideways and that picture moves, it's an accelerometer that does that. It changes the motion, it senses motion and changes your screen based on that motion. And so that's the technology that we had in these. We collared these cows and then made sure that the orientation of these devices were properly placed into a PVC type container that was then put on the collared cows. And then we measured movements. And if you can think of it, when we're looking back to that last picture, when we're trailing cows up to a place, usually when they're walking, that head movement is usually a bobbing motion, right? Up and down in that Z axis. And grazing, usually coordinated with a side-to-side motion, right? And then resting, usually no head movement at all. And so to do this, now that I should say, the accelerometer measured activity 25 times per second. And if you can imagine how many data points that actually collected, it created a lot of data in this study. And thankfully, Dr. Sprinkle was the one who sifted through all this data and got all that information put together. So big credit to him for being able to get through that and get us something that we can actually put forward in a presentation. GPS locations were measured every 5 to 7 minutes. And this is a picture. So during the first 4 days of our study, we actually had a bunch of riders on horseback. Myself, Dan was one of them, Dr. Sprinkle, Justin Hatch. We would actually go out and follow these cows for 4 days on horseback. We were trying not to disturb them too much, but we were watching. And what we were watching for instance, we'd be riding along, maybe come up over the top of a hill, looking down into one of the low spots, and we see a group of cattle. Well, we would sit up there with our computer tablets, and we would pull out our binoculars, and I've got some pictures later of that. But we would identify, okay, this cow number 33, she's just sitting there chewing her cud. She's just rested. So we would put a timestamp on that, the timestamp as well as the animal number, and we would then kind of do a start, and she'd be just resting for 15 minutes. And maybe another cow is actively grazing, or we see another cow that's walking. But over 4 days, we went across that entire allotment collecting this data of what each of these cows were doing. And the reason that we did this, because every cow is different. We put the accelerometers and the collars on these cows, but every cow has a different mannerism. I mean, if you think, if you're at home and you hear somebody walking on a wood floor, you might have a guess on who that might be just based on the steps that they're taking. A quick step, a slow step, maybe you can hear a foot dragging. You kind of know that because everybody has a different walk. Same thing with the cattle. We have different behaviors, and we wanted to identify that so that over the course of those 27 days, we could look back at these 4 days and say, oh, I know what that cow was doing on day 15 because we were watching these. This is an example of just one cow that was looked at, and on this cow in particular, we were able to look at the y-axis and say if there was some data above or below about a 0.23, that was indicative this animal was actively grazing. If it was between that and about another 0.23, almost a 0.3, that was indicative that this cow was actively out walking, and then anything below that was resting. And these equations had to be done for every single cow due to these variations in these individuals. And this is a map just to kind of give you a picture across that allotment. Would be, I think, day 2, yeah, 10/27. So this was on the second day after we had collared these cows. On one specific cow, from midnight to about 1 o'clock, she was up here kind of at the northern part of the grazing allotment and did a little bit of grazing. Stopped moving a little after almost 2 o'clock and rested until about 7 o'clock in the morning, and then kind of continued on, lost GPS reception a little bit, and traveled down here to kind of a more middle portion where we had found this cowboy is indicative of where we actually documented with our tablets what that animal, we found that animal and we documented on what this animal was doing. And so right here, I think number 7, we documented that she was resting between 2:13 and 2:43. And then then she got up and walked up a little bit of ways, walked and grazed for a while. And then we were riding around again, we kind of just did all over the place. Dan, there really wasn't any rhyme or reason for where we were going. We were on horseback. That was a great day at the office for me. I was enjoying myself. So then we found that cow again up here and documented again that she was grazing specifically. So you can see all these purple dots are individual GPS locations that were accumulated by the data on those collars. Monthly precipitation, as I mentioned earlier, we had abnormally more precipitation in October of 2021 than average, and you can see there that bar being quite a bit higher in October. A lot of precipitation, which caused a lot of green up. We didn't have as cold of temperatures as well, so freezing didn't occur. We're able to get quite a bit of grass on that. And this is shown through some satellite imagery that was taken. This is a program with the University of Arizona that you can do some satellite imagery to determine how much green forage is actually in a specific location. And hopefully in the future, we've got some ideas to maybe work toward using some of this and growing degree days and precipitation to kind of accumulating some of that to generate some recommendations on when it's necessary to supplement with protein and energy, and when that might be useful to have. But in 2021, this is a good picture of Dan there on Dr. Sprinkle's horse Rainy, but you can see that green grass was fetlock deep. There's plenty of green forage in 2021. And these cattle were actively grazing when they got on that allotment. 2022, not so much. More of what we would consider a dormant season grazing allotment for those 27 days. And you can see Dr. Sprinkle, and I believe that's Dan there, with binoculars actively looking, and we try not to get up too close so that we didn't disturb what they were naturally doing. So we had our binoculars out and just trying, oh, what tag number is that? And, it was a good time. So back to, some of the data that we did get from this, there was no significant difference between the amount of forage, in between the 2 years. However, there was a large difference in the quality, of nutrition. And we'll see why that had an effect in a minute. But in 2022, lab tested, we did see that there was a 49% total digestible nutrients in the grasses with about a 3.4% crude protein. In 2021, we unfortunately were not able to get a analysis done on that, but it would have come out to an estimated 58% TDN. So much higher, much better quality grass. Some temperature and weather here. I've talked about that a little bit, but as we begin to dive into nutrition and the forage quality that we have, we saw that decrease in nutrition negatively affected these cattle. We did not supplement these cattle because of the research aspects of the trial, but we saw that in 2021, these animals gained about 0.6 pounds per day per cow. That was their average daily gain. But in 2022, we saw that they lost weight. They lost 1.8 pounds per day because of the lower quality forage and the fact that there was a few more winter storms that caused some reduction in grazing during 2022. Now, both years they started out at the same body condition score, right at about a 5. Right about a 5 body condition score at the very beginning, and then at the end, same body condition score in 2021. Because they were able to gain some weight and they did well. But in 2022, they went down to a 4.3 body condition score, significantly different from that previous year. Weight change had significant tendencies as well. And I've already mentioned those average daily gains, which was attributed to those lower qualities and the fact that they grazed more. And we saw that on the left-hand side here is the 2021. And across the bottom axis, this is the grazing time. How many hours a day did they spend grazing? And on the vertical axis is their average daily gain. And you can see that in 2021, the more an animal grazed, the more she was able to gain. The quality of nutrition was such that even though that cow spent more energy to go out and eat forage, she was able to compensate that energy and nutritional requirements with the forage that was available. However, the opposite was shown in 2022, and sometimes we have the mindset of, well, we need to leave them out there so they clean everything up. They need to just eat more. Well, the rumen can only hold so much, and a lower quality forage is not going to pass through the rumen as quickly, and so therefore they're just not going to be able to intake as much. I'm going to slide on that in a minute. But the longer cows grazed in 2022, the more weight they lost, which is kind of an you wouldn't think that's so, but we've got some numbers really to back that up. Daily travel, they didn't travel quite so much, and they didn't go to higher elevations quite as much in 2022, but they did spend more time on those north slopes, and some of that was because of the poorer weather that we had, more winter storms, and perhaps trying to find shelter, perhaps just trying to find better quality of forage to graze. Total grazing hours, we see that there was more, if we look at the grazing hours in 2022, the max grazing hours was about 15.9 compared to in 2021 was only about 13.9. So more grazing was done because they were actively trying to look for better quality stuff to eat. And this is also shown, that orange line, more time was spent grazing until they hit some of the winter storms. Winter storms in 2022 occurred on October 26th, so right as we put them in that grazing allotment, the 3rd through the 6th of November, and then into also that beginning of November. And then trying to drop back down, and then rose above the 2021 grazing times as well. And as far as time of the day, we saw that in 2022, cattle tended to get up earlier and graze more in the graze earlier in the morning and later into the evening. And some of the thoughts behind this is they were just trying to get to a thermoneutral state. When you are cold, what do? You want to get up, you want to move, you want to do something, because just sitting there and being cold is miserable. These cows can feel that same thing. So that's kind of one of the theories that we have there, is they were trying to get up earlier to get up and move and get to that thermoneutral state. Well, they also saw Dr. Sprinkle and associates had done some research in Du Bois on another project and saw some of those same tendencies, that these cattle would get up earlier and graze later in the evening just to try and get their body temperature up. This was just some GPS. You can see the different days on where this specific cow was throughout those 27 days, and they had gone kind of up and down through that allotment looking for forage. I'm gonna move past a couple of these. And then those north slopes were more commonly used. And then here, and with this cow specifically, there was a storm, as I mentioned, in the November 3rd through the 5th. And we can see that storm caused grazing time to decrease because they were looking for shelter, looking for somewhere to hide out of the weather. And then once that storm stopped, those grazing hours rebounded way back up to actively find stuff to eat. Now, how does all this, the behavior, tie into nutrition? And I've spoken about that a little bit, but when we're looking at our perennial grasses, earlier in the year, quality of our perennial grasses is great. The protein level is a lot higher as we go through May, June, even into July a little bit. Protein is pretty good. We start getting the maturity of that plant aging out, the quality of that will decline. And so the requirement for rumen function within cattle is right at about that 7.5% crude protein is what we're aiming for. So anything below that is going to mean dipping into reserves. They're not eating enough to meet those minimum and basic requirements. With cheatgrass and annual grasses, they mature a lot earlier, and so we see that even early May, early June, we're starting to get into lower quality forages. And of course, cattle usually won't eat cheatgrass much after it heads out. But in the fall, when dormant season grazing, it's starting to get into that litter type stage, it does get a little softer, a little palletier, starting that plant material breaking down. Cattle are able to eat it a little bit, but there still is no nutrients there. They're getting the rumen fill, but it's not passing through the rumen and not being really of any nutritional benefit. And because of that rumen fill, anything below about that 6% crude protein, we see that our intakes decrease drastically. And this has been seen over many years. I mean, this study from 1995 was talking about the forage intake. When we talk about forage digestibility or some of that, about a 52 is where we're looking for. Anything below that, we're not meeting requirements. Anything above that, they're doing great, right? This is just an image of as those plants mature, they get more cellulose, more lignin, they're harder to break down. And the microbiome within the rumen can break it down, but it's going to take them a lot longer than forages that haven't built up all of those structural carbohydrates and are much easier to digest and provide volatile fatty acids and proteins to this ruminant animal. And this was some harvesting rate that was looked at previously. But if an animal has supplementation and there is better, of course, that animal is doing better nutritionally, they are going to have a higher bite rate, higher harvesting rate, as opposed to pasture that is not supplemented, whether it's just a single grazing or a rotated pasture. Now, we talked about costs of protein, costs of supplements, and is it, how much are we, is it gonna be worth it, worth our time to be putting this out? And I would argue, yes. And this is some, numbers that Dr. Sprinkle put together and just some math that he put up on this slide. But say we did some supplementation, during our fall grazing, and their body condition score wean was 4.9. And they were able to increase to 5.3 because we paid $9 a head for protein to supplement during this grazing period. Now, in order to maintain that, if we're shooting for that body condition score of 5-ish at calving, we only need to be feeding about a 52% TDN, right at that mark of meeting those basic requirements. And with the feed costs that Dr. Sprinkle has put into these equations, that total feed costs about $184 in that year. As opposed to if supplementation is not given, we're not paying anything up front, but to get our, if we're going to end up with about a 4.3 body condition score, in order to put weight back on that animal and get that body condition score back up, we're going to need to feed a higher quality hay, which is going to cost us more, right? And so total feed cost at the very end going to be about $230. Difference, $46. And so we can either pay it up front, we can pay it on the end. And then this aspect might be cheaper in the long run to supplement. It's easier to keep weight on an animal than it is to put it back on, for sure. And I know many of I see a lot of heads nodding here in the room that this is a true fact that's kind of been known for a while, but we're getting some numbers put behind that. It's going to cost about 2 to 3 times more to put weight back on that animal. So pay now or pay later. That's what we got. With conclusions, grazed on all of that we saw with these cattle, grazed a lot on the south slopes with the better forages, unless there was predominantly winter storms or lower forages, and then there seemed to be a lot more of that north slope grazing. With poor forage quality, cattle did increase grazing time, except with those winter storms. That early rainfall sure helped us in 2021. We saw that precipitation really had a high impact just on these cattle behavior and their nutritional state. Increased grazing time with poor forages. More grazing on poor forages does not equal weight gain. It will equal weight loss because they're not able to meet those minimum nutritional needs. And then that satellite imagery, as I had mentioned, really assists in predicting when protein supplements is needed, and something that we hope to work toward in the future on getting some more information on. So